She noticed him before he noticed her, the way his eyes scanned the subway platform with methodical precision while his hands remained perfectly still at his sides. Most people would see just another commuter waiting for the 6:15 train, but Dr. Rebecca Hayes, sitting with her guitar case open for donations, saw something else entirely, the behavioral patterns of a predator selecting his next victim. The irony was almost perfect. The serial killer hunting in the shadows had no idea he was being watched by someone who'd spent 18 years teaching FBI agents how to think exactly like him. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing to hear more untold stories of those who've dedicated their lives to understanding the darkest corners of human nature, often at great personal cost. Penn Station at rush hour was a symphony of controlled chaos, 34 platforms channeling 500,000 commuters through arteries of steel and concrete that never slept. For most people, it was just another part of New York's urban machinery, a necessary transit point between where they were and where they needed to be. But for Dr. Rebecca Hayes, sitting in her carefully chosen position near Platform 7, with a battered acoustic guitar and an open case collecting spare change, it was the perfect laboratory for studying human behavior. At 53, Rebecca moved through the world with the deliberate invisibility of someone who'd spent decades observing without being observed. Her clothes were layered and worn, not expensive enough to attract attention from criminals, not desperate enough to draw concern from security. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face bore the kind of unremarkable middle-aged features that people's eyes slid past without recording. The perfect camouflage for someone who needed to disappear into urban background noise. 3 years ago, she'd been Dr. Rebecca Hayes, supervisory special agent with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the woman federal prosecutors called when they needed someone to crawl inside a killer's mind and explain to juries how monsters thought. She'd developed profiles that solved cases from Seattle to Miami, trained agents who now ran field offices across the country, and written psychological assessments that helped put some of America's most dangerous predators in maximum security prisons. She'd also buried her 18-year-old daughter Emma, victim of a drunk driver who'd walked away from the accident while Emma bled out on a highway median strip in Northern Virginia. The transition from FBI consultant to subway musician hadn't been planned so much as inevitable. After Emma's death, Rebecca found that she couldn't look at another crime scene photograph without seeing her daughter's face superimposed over the victim's. She couldn't write another psychological profile without calculating how many other daughters would die while predators remained free. And she couldn't sit in another federal courthouse listening to defense attorneys argue that their clients were misunderstood rather than monstrous. So she'd resigned from the bureau, moved to New York, and tried to learn how to create something beautiful instead of hunting something evil. But some skills don't fade with retirement, and some instincts can't be silenced by career changes. Rebecca played guitar because music filled the spaces in her mind that used to be occupied by behavioral analysis and criminal psychology. The melodies gave her something to focus on besides the constant stream of people flowing through the station, each carrying their own secrets, fears, and potential for both kindness and violence. But she still noticed things, still cataloged behavioral patterns, still identified the subtle signs that separated ordinary commuters from the predators who hunted among them, which was why she'd been watching Marcus Webb for 6 weeks. He appeared every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 6:10 p.m., always alone, always carrying the same black messenger bag, always positioning himself near the platform edge where he could observe incoming passengers without being easily observed himself. His clothes were expensive but unremarkable, the kind of business casual that suggested professional success without drawing attention. His posture was relaxed but alert, and his movements had the controlled precision of someone who was accustomed to planning his actions carefully. To casual observation, Marcus Webb looked like thousands of other commuters who passed through Penn Station daily, but Rebecca's observation was far from casual, and what she saw violated every principle of normal human behavior. Normal people waiting for trains displayed predictable patterns, checking phones, reading, shifting weight from foot to foot, engaging in brief conversations with strangers. They showed the minor fidgeting and micro-expressions that revealed ordinary human emotion, impatience, boredom, fatigue, anticipation. Marcus Webb showed none of these things. His breathing was controlled and regular. His facial expressions remained neutral regardless of external stimuli. His hands never moved unless he consciously directed them to do so, and his eyes moved with the systematic methodology of someone conducting surveillance rather than the random scanning of someone simply waiting for transportation. Most telling was his selection process. Webb's attention focused exclusively on women traveling alone, specifically those who fit a very narrow demographic profile: college age, dark hair, approximately 5'4" inches to 5'6" inches in height, carrying earbuds or headphones, dressed in clothes that suggested middle-class backgrounds rather than wealthy families who would be missed immediately. The same profile as 18 victims across 3 states who disappeared over the past 8 months. Rebecca had been monitoring FBI missing persons databases through contacts she'd maintained after her retirement. The pattern was subtle: young women vanishing from transportation hubs, last seen on security cameras before surveillance gaps that suggested sophisticated knowledge of urban monitoring systems. No bodies had been recovered, which meant either the victims were still alive somewhere or the killer was extremely skilled at disposal. Rebecca suspected the latter, and she suspected Marcus Webb was responsible. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence required the kind of systematic investigation that she was no longer authorized to conduct. So she'd positioned herself in Penn Station's surveillance ecosystem, using her musician's invisibility to document Webb's behavioral patterns while waiting for him to make the mistake that would give her the proof she needed. Tonight felt different. Webb's micro-expressions suggested elevated stress, and his scanning pattern was more focused than usual. He was moving closer to action, progressing through the psychological stages that preceded violent behavior. Rebecca continued playing her acoustic version of The Sound of Silence, the irony of the song not lost on her as she watched a predator preparing to hunt. Her fingers moved across the guitar strings with practiced ease while her mind cataloged Webb's behavioral escalation. At 6:23 p.m., his target selection process intensified. A young woman with dark hair and the kind of distracted vulnerability that predators instinctively recognized had caught his attention. She was approximately 22 years old, traveling alone, wearing headphones that isolated her from environmental awareness, and carrying a backpack that suggested student status rather than professional employment. Perfect victim profile. And Webb was beginning to move. Rebecca's training kicked in with the automatic precision of muscle memory. She noted Webb's positioning relative to his target, identified his probable approach strategy, and calculated intervention points where his actions could be disrupted without creating public panic. But she also faced a fundamental problem: she was no longer FBI. She had no badge, no legal authority, and no official backing for the investigation she'd been conducting. If she approached local law enforcement with her suspicions, they would see a retired federal agent with possible mental health issues rather than a credible witness to ongoing criminal activity. And if she was wrong about Webb, her intervention could destroy an innocent man's life and end her own credibility permanently. But if she was right, and she did nothing, another daughter would disappear into the kind of nightmare that kept experienced investigators awake at night. Rebecca made her choice the same way she'd made every important decision in her career, by trusting 18 years of training and experience over the convenience of uncertainty. She began packing her guitar while keeping Webb and his intended victim in her peripheral vision. If he was going to escalate to action, she would be ready to respond. Because some instincts were too strong to ignore, and some evil was too dangerous to observe without interference. Marcus Webb had perfected his hunting methodology over the course of 18 months and 11 successful acquisitions. Penn Station provided the ideal environment, massive crowds that created anonymity, multiple exit routes that prevented containment, and security systems that could be avoided through careful timing and positioning. Most importantly, it offered a steady supply of targets who fit his very specific requirements. He'd studied behavioral psychology extensively, not from academic interest but from practical necessity. Understanding how people thought, how they moved, how they responded to subtle manipulations was essential for someone in his profession. And Marcus Webb was very good at his profession. Tonight's target had been selected through careful observation over multiple surveillance cycles. Kimberly Chen, 23 years old, graduate student at Columbia University, living alone in a studio apartment in Washington Heights. She took the same train home every Tuesday and Thursday after her evening classes, always sat in the third car, always wore headphones that would prevent her from hearing approaching footsteps. Perfect vulnerability combined with minimal social network to complicate disappearance investigations. Webb had mapped her routine down to the minute, identified the surveillance gaps between Penn Station and her apartment building, and prepared the containment tools that would ensure her cooperation during transport to his operational facility. Everything was ready for acquisition. What he hadn't anticipated was the street musician. The woman with the guitar had been present during his past several surveillance operations, always in the same general area, always playing the same type of acoustic folk music that attracted modest donations from passing commuters. Initially, he dismissed her as urban background noise, another of the city's marginalized residents trying to survive through minimal skill and maximum persistence. But tonight something about her behavior triggered his threat assessment protocols. Normal musicians engaged with their audiences, made eye contact with potential donors, adjusted their performance based on crowd response. This woman did none of those things. Her focus seemed to be directed elsewhere, and her positioning provided sightlines to areas that wouldn't be relevant to someone primarily interested in collecting donations. More concerning was her timing. She'd begun packing her equipment just as he'd initiated his approach sequence, which could indicate either coincidence or surveillance awareness. Webb recalculated his operational security. If the musician was law enforcement, his entire methodology would be compromised. If she was simply a random civilian, her potential interference could still disrupt his carefully planned acquisition schedule. He decided to test her awareness level. Instead of proceeding directly toward his target, Webb altered his route to pass closer to the musician's position. If she was conducting surveillance, this deviation would trigger observable behavioral responses, subtle positioning adjustments, increased alertness, or communication with unseen handlers. The woman continued packing her guitar with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the evening. No obvious reaction to his approach, no sudden movements, no indication that she was monitoring his activities. But Webb had spent years studying micro-expressions, and he noticed something that most people would miss. The woman's breathing pattern had changed. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest elevated stress response. And her hand positioning had shifted slightly, moving closer to her guitar case in a way that could facilitate rapid access to concealed items. Possible threat. Proceed with elevated caution. Webb continued past the musician's position and approached his target, who was standing approximately 30 feet away checking her phone while waiting for the next train. Standard acquisition protocol called for casual contact, an accidental bump, a dropped item that required retrieval, some form of interaction that would establish physical proximity without raising alarm. But as he closed the distance, Webb became aware that the musician was moving as well. She'd finished packing her equipment and was walking parallel to his approach vector, maintaining a position that would provide both visual contact and intervention capability. Her pace was carefully controlled to avoid appearing hurried, but her route was too precisely calculated to be coincidental. Surveillance awareness confirmed. The musician was law enforcement.
Webb immediately aborted his acquisition attempt and activated his escape protocols. Penn Station's layout provided multiple exit routes that could be used to evade pursuit, and his knowledge of NYPD response patterns would allow him to avoid containment long enough to reach his vehicle and disappear into the city's traffic patterns. But first he needed to neutralize the surveillance threat. Webb altered his direction again, moving toward the musician with the casual confidence of someone who decided to make a donation. If she was indeed law enforcement, she would be operating under legal constraints that prevented her from taking aggressive action without clear evidence of criminal intent. And if she was armed, drawing a weapon in Penn Station's crowded environment would create the kind of public panic that would complicate her mission more than his. He approached her with a smile and reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that could indicate either a weapon or a wallet. The ambiguity would force her to make a tactical decision under pressure, and most law enforcement officers would choose caution over confrontation. "Excuse me," he said in the polite tone he'd perfected for victim acquisition, "I wanted to thank you for the music. It's been a long day, and hearing someone play with such skill really made it better." The woman looked up at him with eyes that Webb immediately recognized as dangerous. Not afraid, not confused, but calculating. She was assessing threat levels and response options with the kind of systematic analysis that suggested extensive training. "Thank you," she replied evenly. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Webb reached slowly into his pocket, maintaining eye contact while gauging her reaction to potential threat indicators. If she was armed law enforcement, this movement would trigger defensive positioning. If she was undercover surveillance, it would force her to choose between maintaining cover and protecting herself. What happened next surprised him. The woman stepped closer rather than creating distance, positioning herself within his personal space in a way that would make drawing a weapon extremely difficult. Simultaneously, she angled her body to block his view of potential escape routes while maintaining her own mobility options. Professional tactical positioning, executed with the kind of precision that suggested federal training rather than local law enforcement. "Mr. Webb," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the ambient noise of the station, "I think we need to talk." The use of his name confirmed that his operational security had been completely compromised. But more concerning was the way she said it, not with the aggressive confidence of someone making an arrest, but with the careful control of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the situation had become. Webb calculated his options rapidly. Fight was possible, but inadvisable, given the environment and her obvious training. Flight was viable, but would confirm guilt and eliminate future operational opportunities. Denial might work if she lacked sufficient evidence for prosecution, but there was a fourth option: information gathering. If this woman was indeed federal law enforcement, she would be operating under specific protocols and legal constraints. Understanding her authority and objectives would help him determine the best response strategy. "I'm sorry," he said, maintaining his polite facade. "Do we know each other?" The woman smiled with the kind of cold professionalism that Webb recognized from his own predatory toolkit. "We haven't been formally introduced, but I've been studying your behavioral patterns for 6 weeks. I know your schedule, your target selection criteria, and your operational methodology." She paused, letting the implications settle before continuing. "Dr. Rebecca Hayes, formerly with the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. And you, Mr. Webb, are about to learn what it feels like to be profiled by someone who understands exactly how your mind works." Webb felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine fear. Not the tactical concern of someone facing operational complications, but the deep psychological terror of prey recognizing a superior predator. Because he suddenly understood that the woman he'd dismissed as urban background noise was actually the most dangerous opponent he'd ever encountered. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had interrogated enough predators to recognize the exact moment when they realized their game was over. It wasn't fear that flickered across Marcus Webb's face. It was something deeper and more primitive, the sudden understanding that he was no longer the hunter. Hayes, Webb said carefully, his voice maintaining its practiced calm while his micro-expressions revealed the psychological recalculation happening behind his eyes. I'm not sure what you think you know about me, but I know that you've been stalking young women in transportation hubs across 3 states for the past 8 months. Rebecca interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once silenced federal judges during expert testimony. I know that you select victims based on very specific demographic criteria that suggest both racial preferences and social engineering calculations. And I know that your behavioral patterns indicate an organized personality type with probable law enforcement or military training. Webb's breathing pattern shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that untrained observers would miss but that revealed significant stress escalation to someone with Rebecca's background. More importantly, she continued, I know that you were approximately 45 seconds away from making contact with Kimberly Chen when I interrupted your approach sequence. Which means we're not discussing theoretical criminal behavior, Mr. Webb, we're discussing attempted kidnapping. The crowd around them continued flowing through Penn Station's corridors, oblivious to the fact that one of America's most wanted serial predators was being confronted by a retired FBI profiler in the middle of their evening commute. Rebecca had positioned them near a structural pillar that provided both concealment from casual observation and acoustic dampening that would prevent their conversation from being overheard. Webb glanced toward the platform where his intended victim was boarding the train he'd planned to follow her onto. The opportunity was disappearing, and Rebecca could see him calculating whether to abandon the current situation and pursue alternative targets. I wouldn't, she said quietly. I've already transmitted your photograph and behavioral profile to NYPD Transit Police. Every officer in the system is now looking for someone matching your description and movement patterns. It was a bluff. Rebecca had no official authority and no active communication with law enforcement. But Webb didn't know that, and the possibility of systematic surveillance would force him to reconsider any immediate plans for continued hunting. Dr. Hayes, Webb said, shifting to a different psychological strategy, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just a commuter trying to get home after work. Whatever behavioral patterns you think you've observed, organized non-social personality with above-average intelligence and probable narcissistic traits, Rebecca interrupted, beginning the kind of psychological autopsy that had made her reputation within the Bureau. You demonstrate controlled emotional responses and calculated social interactions that suggest extensive practice manipulating other people's perceptions. Your clothing choices and grooming indicate sufficient income to support an expensive lifestyle, but your hunting patterns suggest you're not primarily motivated by financial gain. Webb's facial expressions remained neutral, but Rebecca noticed the subtle physical responses that revealed how accurate her assessment was. Decreased blink rate indicating focused attention, slight tension in jaw muscles suggesting suppressed emotional response, and positioning shifts that moved him incrementally closer to potential escape routes. You're hunting for psychological satisfaction rather than material benefit, she continued. The demographic specificity of your target selection indicates personal rather than random motivation, and your knowledge of surveillance systems suggests either professional law enforcement experience or extensive study of criminal investigation methods. She paused, watching Webb's micro-expressions for confirmation of her analysis. Most interesting is your operational security. You've managed to avoid detection for 8 months while maintaining a consistent hunting pattern which suggests both intelligence and experience. But you've also been escalating the frequency of your acquisitions, which indicates that whatever psychological need drives your behavior is becoming more demanding. Webb remained silent, but Rebecca could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was evaluating whether she represented immediate law enforcement action or merely an isolated threat that could be managed through alternative means. The question, Rebecca continued, is whether you're going to escalate to violence here and now, or whether you're intelligent enough to understand that your operational window has closed permanently. For the first time since their conversation began, Webb smiled. Not the practiced social expression he'd been using, but something colder and more authentic. Dr. Hayes, he said, you're making several assumptions that could prove problematic. First, you assume that I'm operating alone. Second, you assume that I'm primarily concerned with avoiding law enforcement attention. And third, you assume that I'm not willing to accept casualties in order to protect my operational freedom. Rebecca felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once accompanied her most dangerous field assignments. Webb was moving beyond psychological defense toward active threat presentation. The conversation was approaching a decision point that would determine whether it ended with arrest or violence. Mr. Webb, she replied, you're making one critical assumption that's about to prove fatal to your cause, which is, you assume that I'm here alone and unprepared for exactly this conversation. Rebecca shifted her position slightly, a movement that brought her closer to her guitar case while simultaneously signaling to observers she'd positioned throughout the station before beginning her approach. They weren't law enforcement, she didn't have that kind of authority anymore, but they were people she'd met during 3 years of playing music in subway stations, people who'd learned to trust her judgment and were willing to help when she indicated that help was needed. Street musicians, maintenance workers, transit employees, and regular commuters who'd become part of the informal network that watched out for each other in the city's underground spaces. Webb's tactical assessment suddenly became much more complicated. What had appeared to be an isolated confrontation with a single retired federal agent was actually a coordinated operation with multiple observers and potential interveners positioned throughout his escape routes. Dr. Hayes, he said, carefully, what exactly do you want? Rebecca's answer was simple and final. I want you to understand that your hunting days are over, permanently. She reached into her guitar case and pulled out a thick manila folder that contained 6 weeks of surveillance notes, behavioral analysis, and photographic documentation of Webb's activities. This contains everything I've compiled about your operational methods, target selection criteria, and schedule patterns. It also includes enough psychological profile information to help federal investigators understand exactly how you think and predict your future behavior. She handed him the folder. Consider it a gift, because in approximately 3 minutes, NYPD Transit Police are going to receive an anonymous tip about a suspected predator matching your description. You have until then to disappear from this station and never return to New York. Webb accepted the folder with the kind of careful control that suggested he understood the gravity of what was being offered. And if I choose to continue my activities elsewhere, Rebecca's smile matched his earlier expression for coldness and authenticity. Then you'll discover that retirement doesn't end friendships with active federal agents, and those agents have resources that retired profilers don't. Webb nodded slowly, recognizing the implicit threat. He was being offered exile rather than arrest, freedom in exchange for geographic restriction. But exile was better than prison, and geographic restriction was better than the kind of federal investigation that would uncover evidence of activities he'd never intended anyone to discover. Dr. Hayes, he said, it's been an educational conversation. Mr. Webb, she replied. I hope it's been educational enough. Webb turned and walked toward the station's main exit with the same controlled precision he'd brought to his hunting activities. But Rebecca knew that his departure from New York wouldn't end his predatory behavior. It would simply relocate it to somewhere that other people would have to deal with the threat he represented. Some problems couldn't be solved permanently by individual action. They could only be managed, contained, and passed along to others with the authority and resources to address them appropriately. Rebecca packed her guitar and prepared to leave Penn Station for the final time. Her 3 years of retirement from active law enforcement were officially over, because some skills were too valuable to waste on street music and some evil was too dangerous to observe without taking action. Tomorrow, she would make phone calls to contacts at Quantico. She would offer her services as a consultant for cases involving organized predators and systematic hunting behavior, and she would begin the process of returning to the work she'd never really been able to leave behind. Because retirement had taught her something important: creating beauty was meaningful, but preventing horror was essential, and some people were too dangerous to be allowed to operate without professional interference. Marcus Webb disappeared into New York's evening crowd, carrying with him the understanding that he was no longer an anonymous predator. He was a known threat being tracked by people who understood exactly how his mind worked, and Dr. Rebecca Hayes returned to federal law enforcement with the kind of real-world operational experience that no training program could provide. She'd faced a serial killer alone and convinced him that disappearing was a better option than fighting. Some retirements end with gold watches, others end with the realization that your country still needs what you do best. 3 days later, Rebecca Hayes walked into the FBI's New York field office wearing a visitor's badge and carrying credentials that would soon be reactivated. Her guitar case was locked in her apartment closet, replaced by the tools of a trade she'd never really abandoned. The street musician had been useful cover for surveillance operations, but Dr. Rebecca Hayes, behavioral analyst and predator hunter, was who she'd always been meant to be. And somewhere in America, Marcus Webb was learning that geography changes location but not psychology. He was still a predator, but now he was a predator being hunted by people who understood him better than he understood himself. The game had changed, and this time the hunters had the advantage.